My name is Deb Stone, and before I talk about my experience growing up at a deaf school, I first want to briefly mention my attendance at the 200-year anniversary of the American School for the Deaf. It was the first school for the deaf that was established in Hartford, Connecticut. I was there for a week and I thoroughly enjoyed all of the activities, including visiting the museum, the cemetery, the Hall of Fame, the banquet, and seeing old friends. It was wonderful. Regarding my experience growing up at a deaf school, I truly had full access to communication in sign language. My experience was fantastic. I would go home and go back to the dorm, and on the weekends I'd go back home, and I thoroughly enjoyed both my home life and my dorm life. I didn't get upset when I had to go back to school. I was always very excited because I had easy communication with my friends at school, whereas at home I didn't have that with my neighbors. The teachers all signed. Some of them were codas, some were deaf, the staff was deaf, some were hearing but could also sign. There was one particular experience with a newer teacher who didn't sign very well, and I had to work very hard to understand her. Sometimes she wouldn't understand the students either, and I would help her to understand us. When the students didn't understand her, I would essentially interpret what she was saying to the other students. It was a very frustrating experience, not an easy one to go through. I enjoyed the dorm. We had many teams, including basketball, football, and volleyball. There was one experience that sticks out with a volleyball game. I went on the bus with the team to compete against a hearing team, and our coach wasn't there because she was sick. There was no referee, and there wasn't any communication access. We tried to play the game, but the other team was cheating, and we felt really disadvantaged. It was the first time I really felt what it meant not to have communication access. The best way I can explain it is to compare it to a supposed normal hearing family who has access to communication 24/7. That's what I had at the deaf school. I can't really give you a good basis for comparison because my experience growing up was really fantastic. My parents are deaf, as is my brother, and my grandparents on my mom's side are deaf as well. My mother's siblings are hearing, but the family signs. My father's family is hearing, and I didn't see them very often. We couldn't really communicate with them. My family could all communicate fluently. I had full access. I could learn from my parents. They talked about their life outside of the house. They would talk about the deaf clubs. So I learned a lot of my life skills directly from my parents. I'm married and my husband is deaf, but he's from a hearing family. When I go to family gatherings for the holidays at his family, I do feel a little bit at a loss because they don't know sign language. It can be very lonely and I often feel left out. I have 3 children who are deaf, and going to family gatherings with my husband's family, I tend to keep to myself and just play with my children and keep them occupied. That's very different than what I experience when I'm with my family that can sign. I certainly understand how deaf children who are born to families that don't sign can become very frustrated, and my heart goes out to them. Some of my deaf friends say that I'm very lucky to come from a deaf family, but it's really not about luck. It's about communication. I can talk about my experience having a full-time job. It so happened that at my first full-time job, my boss had a deaf brother. He knew how to communicate with me, even though he didn't sign fluently. His brother grew up oral, but he knew that communication was important, and he would write instructions back and forth to me. Things did change when I got a different boss. I had a few coworkers who had learned a little bit of sign language, and we would chat while we worked, but my boss complained that we talked too much. Hearing coworkers would talk to each other all day long, and I would just have little snippets of conversation with my coworkers who could sign. It felt very unfair. As I went through to different jobs, a lot of people didn't know how to communicate with me as a deaf person, and I often felt left out. I finally started working for an agency that provided services for the deaf, so my coworkers could all sign fluently. I learned a lot and experienced a lot of personal growth because everyone could communicate. I learned about the business world, life outside of that, and a lot of policy information that I didn't learn before. For deaf people who work in hearing environments where they don't have access to communication, they'll often complain about the environment and will experience a lot of loneliness. Some people don't care and they'll just do their job and go home, but for others, they really desire that access to communication. My tips or advice for the hearing community would be don't be afraid of deaf and hard of hearing people. Just try your best to communicate, consider writing back and forth, using gestures or pictures, maybe take an ASL class that's offered in the community. Sometimes when you're talking to someone who doesn't speak English, you may gesture with them and make the best of it. It's the same with deaf individuals. Just don't be afraid to try.